My mother stood up at my 50th birthday dinner and said she had something to tell me. 14 people at the table: my husband, my daughter, my brother and his wife, my closest friends, candles still burning on the cake they had not yet cut. She said, "I have been waiting for the right time to say this for 30 years. I have decided there is no right time, so I am saying it now." I put down my fork. What she said next took 11 minutes. I know because I looked at my watch when she sat down, and it was 8:47. And I looked again when she finished, and it was 8:58. And the 11 minutes between those two times contained something that rearranged every memory I had of my own life. Let me tell you what came before, because the before matters. My name is Kathleen. I turned 50 in October in a private room at a restaurant in Nashville that my husband Greg had reserved 4 months in advance. He is a planner. It is one of the things I have always loved about him. He had arranged the flowers and the menu and the guest list and the small framed photographs on the table, pictures from every decade of my life, me at 10 and 20 and 30 and 40, and one from the week before of me and our daughter Lily in the garden. My mother's name is Frances. She is 78 years old and has always been the most composed person I know. She taught high school English for 31 years. She raised my brother Martin and me after my father left when I was 9. She did not cry at my wedding. She did not cry when my father died, which was 7 years ago, and which she attended out of what she described as basic human decency. She is not a woman who is easily moved to public displays. When she stood up at that dinner table, her hands were shaking. Before I tell you the rest, subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it will stay with you. And drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one. Now let me tell you, I noticed the hands first. That was what made me put down the fork. I had seen my mother angry, tired, frustrated, quietly devastated. I had never seen her hands shake. She said, "What I am about to tell you is not something I am telling you to hurt you. I am telling you because you are 50 years old today, and you deserve to know who you are." The table went very quiet. She said, "The man you knew as your father was not your biological father." She said, "Your biological father is a man named Robert Calloway. He lives in Knoxville. He is 74 years old. He knows you exist. He has known since before you were born." She said, "I made a decision 30 years ago to tell you when you turned 50. I chose 50 because I thought by then you would be solid enough in yourself to hold this. I hope I was right." Then she sat down. Her hands were still shaking. She put them in her lap. What happened at that table, and what happened after? Nobody spoke for a moment. 14 people and complete silence, which in a restaurant private room has a very specific quality. You can hear the sounds of the kitchen through the wall and the muffled noise of other tables, and nothing from your own. Greg reached under the table and took my hand. I did not look at him. I looked at my mother. I said, "How long have you been planning to say that tonight?" She said, "Since your 49th birthday." I said, "A year." She said, "I needed time to find the right words. I don't think I found them, but I said what was true." My brother Martin was sitting to my left. He is 53. He said nothing. I looked at him and he met my eyes, and I understood, from the specific quality of his expression, that he had known. Not tonight. He had known before tonight. He looked at me with the face of someone who has been carrying something that does not belong to him and is watching it be put down. I said, "Martin." He said, "I found out 6 years ago. Mom asked me not to tell you. She said she wanted to be the one." I said, "6 years?" He said, "Kath." I said, "No, not yet." I turned back to my mother. I said, "Robert Calloway." She said, "Yes." I said, "Does he want to know me?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He has wanted to know you since before you were born." I was the one who said no. This was the second thing that rearranged the room. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I was 27 years old and frightened, and I chose the life I could see over the life I could not. I have spent 30 years deciding whether that was the right choice. I still do not know." Greg's hand tightened on mine. I said, "Does he know you're telling me tonight?" She said, "I called him in September. I told him I was going to tell you on your birthday." He said, "Please give her my number." She reached into the small bag she had set on her chair when she sat down. She put a folded piece of paper on the table in front of me. I looked at it. I did not pick it up. I said, "Okay." My friend Dana, who has known me for 22 years and who I have always trusted to read a room, looked at Lily and said quietly, "Should we give them a minute?" And the table began to move, carefully, without drama, the way people move when they understand that something private is happening in a public space. Within 3 minutes, it was Greg and Martin and my mother and me. In the piece of paper in front of me. I want to be honest about what I felt in those 3 minutes after the table cleared, because it was not one thing, and it did not make complete sense. I was not angry. That surprised me, and it surprised Greg, who told me later he had been preparing for anger. What I felt was something more like vertigo, the specific sensation of the ground being where it has always been, and also not quite where you thought it was. I was still myself. I was 50 years old and sitting at a birthday dinner with candles on a cake and a husband holding my hand. None of that had changed. And also, everything was different, in a way I could not yet fully see. I picked up the piece of paper. There was a phone number, and below it, in my mother's handwriting, "Robert. He is a good man." That was her judgment. I put it in my pocket. Then I looked at Martin. I said, "Tell me what you know." He told me. He had found out 6 years ago, accidentally. He had been looking through old photographs at our mother's house and had found a letter, and he had asked her about it, and she had told him. He said, "I thought about calling you 100 times. I didn't know how." I said, "You should have called me." He said, "I know. I'm sorry." I said, "We'll talk about it. Not tonight." He nodded. I looked at my mother. She was watching me with the expression of a person who has been waiting a very long time for a verdict and is not certain they deserve mercy. I said, "Why tonight? Specifically tonight?" She said, "Because I am 78 years old. Because I have had 2 health scares in the last year that I did not tell you about. Because I did not want to die with you not knowing. And because I have looked at you for 50 years and thought you deserved the truth and kept making reasons to wait, and tonight I ran out of reasons." The 2 health scares landed with the weight they were meant to. I said, "What health scares?" She said, "My heart." The first one was minor. The second was less minor. I am fine now. The doctors are managing it. But I stopped being willing to wait. I said, "You should have told me." She said, "I know. There are several things I should have told you." We sat there for a long time. The candles burned down. Someone from the restaurant came in once to ask if we needed anything, and Greg sent them away with the particular calm authority he has always been good at. At some point, I said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She said, "Yes." I said, "Do you regret it, not telling me? The whole thing?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I regret the silence. I do not regret choosing the life I chose, because it was the life that had you in it. But the silence was wrong. I knew it was wrong every year I let it continue." I said, "Did you love him, Robert?" She said, "Yes, briefly and completely, and in a way that I understood was not going to be my life. He was moving to another city. We were 26. The world was different. I made a choice." I said, "And the man I knew as my father?" She said, "Your father loved you. Whatever else he was, and he was not perfect, he loved you. He knew. He chose you." This was something I had not expected to hear, and that landed more softly than everything else. I said, "He knew." She said, "From the beginning. It was the only lie I ever told him, and the only one he ever forgave completely." I thought about my father, the one I had grown up with, the one who had left when I was 9 for reasons that were complicated and had never been fully explained to me, the one who had died 7 years ago, before I had asked all the questions I should have asked. I thought about what it cost him to know and stay for 9 years, and I thought about what it cost him to leave, and I understood that I was, even now, even with everything I had just heard, still his daughter, in all the ways that had made me who I was. I said, "Okay." My mother said, "Okay." I said, "I'm not saying it's okay. I'm saying I've heard you. I need time with this before I know what I think." She nodded. I said, "I'm going to call him. Robert. Not tonight, but I'm going to call him." She said, "I hoped you would." Greg brought the rest of the guests back in after a while. We ate the cake. People were careful with me in the way people are careful when something significant has happened and they are not sure of the protocol. Dana sat next to me and said nothing useful and everything necessary, which is her particular gift. Lily, who was 23 and perceptive in the way that young women who have been paying attention their whole lives are perceptive, held my hand under the table for the last 40 minutes of the dinner without drawing attention to it. I called Robert Calloway on a Thursday morning, 12 days after my birthday. I had spent 12 days with the piece of paper in my desk drawer and the phone number in my memory, which is where it had moved within the first day without my trying. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Kathleen?" I said, "Yes, this is Kathleen." There was a pause. Then he said, "I have been hoping you would call. I did not know if you would." I said, "I needed some time." He said, "I understand. I have had 50 years. You have had 12 days. Take whatever you need." This was the correct thing to say. I noticed it was the correct thing to say and filed it. I said, "I have some questions." He said, "I expected that. Ask me anything." I asked him things. He answered them. The conversation lasted an hour and 40 minutes, and I took notes, which is something I do when I want to remember things clearly, and which Greg later told me he found both very me and quietly heartbreaking to watch. What I learned. He had been a graduate student in Nashville for 2 years. He had met my mother at a faculty party. The relationship had been real on both sides and brief. When she told him she was pregnant, he had offered to stay. She had said no. He had moved to Knoxville as planned and had spent 50 years not knowing if he would ever hear from the child he had not been allowed to know. He had married. He had 2 sons, both older than me. He was a retired professor of civil engineering. He had a garden. He had a dog named Franklin who was elderly and moved slowly. When I asked him if he had thought about me over the years, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought about you on every birthday. I did not know your name until September, but I knew you existed and I thought about you." I said, "October 14th. He said, "I know. Your mother told me in September." She said, "Her name is Kathleen and her birthday is October 14th and she is turning 50. Something in me went quiet when he said that. I said, "I need to tell you something." He said, "Okay." I said, "I don't know what this is yet. I don't know what I want it to be or if it can be anything. I am 50 years old and I have a father. I had a father, he is dead now, and I am not looking to replace him." He said, "I understand." I said, "But I am also a person who prefers knowing to not knowing, and I know your name now, and I know your voice. I think I would like to continue knowing you." He said, "I would like that very much." I said, "Slowly." He said, "As slowly as you need." We spoke again 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that. The calls are not long, 40 minutes, an hour, and they have a careful quality, the quality of two people building something without knowing exactly what they are building, testing each weight before they put it down. I met him in February. He drove to Nashville. We had lunch at a restaurant downtown, the two of us, and I studied his face the way you study a thing you are trying to understand, and I found some things I recognized and some things I did not, and all of it was a great deal to hold. He is a quiet man, measured. He chooses his words carefully, which I was told later by one of his sons, we have exchanged emails now, cautious and polite, is simply how he is. I found over 2 hours of lunch that I am also a person who chooses words carefully, that we both order our thoughts before speaking, that we both have the habit of writing things down. I do not know what to call what is happening between us. It does not have a name I am comfortable with yet, and I have decided not to force one. He is a man I am coming to know, slowly, who shares some things with me that I did not expect to share with anyone, and who looks at me sometimes across a table with an expression I cannot quite read, but which I think is something like, "There you are." My mother and I have talked, several times, and not easily. There are things I am still working through about the silence. 30 years of a fact about my own life that I did not have access to, which is its own kind of loss, separate from everything else. I am not finished working through them. I do not think she expected me to be finished quickly, and I appreciate that she has not asked me to be. She asked me once, in March, whether I had forgiven her. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "I am getting there." She said, "That is more than I deserve." I said, "Probably, but you told me. You ran out of reasons to wait." I am trying to count that for something. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me yet. I'm still working on it." She said, "I know. I can wait." My daughter Lily knows the full story. She is 23 and took it in with a specific seriousness she brings to things that matter. She asked me one question that nobody else had asked. "Do you feel different about yourself?" I thought about it. Then I said, "I feel like I have more information about myself. Whether I feel different is still becoming clear." She said, "That's a very careful answer." I said, "I'm a careful person." She said, "I know where you got it." I said, "So do I." a little better than I did before. I keep the piece of paper my mother put on the table. It is in my desk now, not the drawer, but in a small frame, because Greg framed it last month without telling me and set it on the desk next to the photograph of me and Lily in the garden. I found it there on a Tuesday morning and stood looking at it for a while. I said, "You framed it." He said, "You were going to keep it in the drawer forever." I said, "I was going to find a better place for it eventually." He said, "This is a better place." He was right. The number is there now, in my mother's handwriting, and below it, her judgment. Robert. He is a good man. I am still deciding what I think about that. I think she is probably right. I think the deciding is part of it. October 14th. I turned 50. My mother stood up at my birthday dinner and told me the truth, which she had been carrying for 30 years, which I have now been carrying for 5 months, which I am learning to carry differently as the months go on. The candles burned down. We ate the cake. I have a phone number in a frame on my desk, and a man in Knoxville who thinks about me on my birthday, and 2 half-brothers who send me careful emails, and a mother who ran out of reasons to wait, and a husband who frames things without asking, and a daughter who asked the right question. I am 50 years old. I know more about myself than I did at 49. Some of what I know is hard to hold. Most of it, slowly, is becoming mine. I want to tell you about the specific texture of the weeks between my birthday and the phone call. 12 days is not a long time in the ordinary sense. In this particular sense, it was very long. Greg and I talked about it every night. He is the kind of husband who knows when to ask questions and when to sit with something quietly, and he got the balance right, which he usually does. He asked me once, on the 3rd night, "What do you want to do with it?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "That's okay." I said, "Is it?" He said, "You just found out something significant about your own life. You're allowed to not know for a while." I thought about that. I said, "She had it for 30 years. He said, "She did." I said, "And she gave it to me at a birthday dinner in front of 14 people. He said, "Yes." I said, "That was either the bravest thing she's ever done or the most peculiar choice of venue in recorded history." He said, "I think it was both." I said, "Yes, I think it was both." My friend Dana called the next morning. She had been at the dinner, had been one of the people who quietly left the room when it became clear that what was happening was private. She said, "I'm calling to check on you." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "I need to think." She said, "Okay." She said, "For what it's worth, your mother looked terrified." I said, "I know." She said, "She loves you." I said, "I know that too. It doesn't make the 30 years disappear." She said, "No, it doesn't." I said, "But I know." She said, "Okay." Dana has a gift for conversations that are short because they contain everything necessary. I thought in those 12 days about my father, the man who raised me, who left when I was 9, who died when I was 45. I thought about what I had not understood about him and might now understand better. He had known. He had chosen me anyway. He had stayed for 9 years and then he had left, and the leaving had never made complete sense to me, and it still did not make complete sense, but it had a new texture now, a new possible set of reasons that I could not evaluate because he was no longer here to ask. I thought about asking my mother. I decided to wait. There were too many things to ask her at once, and I did not want to have all of those conversations before I was ready for them. What I did in those 12 days, practically, was research. I looked up Robert Calloway online. There is not a great deal. He is a private person, or was before the internet made privacy complicated. I found a university faculty page from before his retirement, a photograph of a thin man with silver hair and glasses who looked nothing like me, and also, in one specific quality of the expression around the eyes, slightly like me. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I found an article he had written for an engineering journal, technical and precise, well organized. I read all of it, even though I do not understand civil engineering, because I wanted to know how his mind worked. It worked in an orderly way. He moved through a problem directly, without unnecessary elaboration, stated his conclusions clearly. I found this both comforting and strange. I showed the photograph to Lily. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at me and said, "The eyes." I said, "Yes." She said, "That must be strange." I said, "It is." She said, "Are you going to call him?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When?" I said, "When I'm ready." She said, "Okay." She handed the phone back without drama, which is one of the things I have always admired about her. I called on a Thursday because Thursdays have always felt like the right day to do difficult things. I do not have a rational explanation for this. It is simply true for me and has been for as long as I can remember. He answered on the second ring. His voice was lower than I expected, calm, unhurried, with the specific quality of someone who has thought about what they might say and decided to say nothing prepared. Just, "Kathleen?" The way he said my name was the first disorienting thing. He said it like someone who has been saying it to himself for a long time. After the lunch in February, I drove home alone. Greg had offered to come, but I had said, "I need to do this part alone." He understood, which is one of the reasons I married him. I drove home and I sat in the car in our driveway for 20 minutes. Not crying. I did not cry that day. Just sitting. The radio was off. It was a cold February afternoon and the light was the specific gray of Nashville in winter. And I sat there with the engine off, thinking about what it is to meet someone who is part of you that you have never known. What I felt was not what I expected. I had expected something dramatic, some seismic recognition, some overwhelming sense of connection or its absence. What I felt instead was quieter than that. Something like, "Oh, there you are. You are a real person and not just a fact. You have a voice and a way of tilting your head when you are thinking, and a dog named Franklin and a garden in Knoxville, and the same habit I have of pausing before you answer a question because you want to get the answer right." I felt, sitting in the driveway in the February gray, that I had been given something I did not know how to hold yet, but that I did not want to put down. Martin called that evening. He said, "How did it go?" I said, "It went." He said, "That's not an answer." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." I said, "I know." He said, 6 years is too long." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was afraid of what it would do." I said, "Martin." He said, "Yeah." I said, "We're going to be fine." He said, "Yeah?" I said, "Yes, but you owe me." He said, "I know. Name it." I said, "I'll think of something." He said, "That's worse." I said, "I know." This is how Martin and I have always talked. Some things do not change when the ground shifts. This was good to discover. Greg framed the piece of paper in March, as I said. On the night he put it on my desk, we sat in the kitchen afterward with tea, and he said, "How are you doing with all of it, actually?" Not the answer you give other people. The actual answer. I thought about it. I said, "I am doing better than I expected. I am also doing harder than I expected. Both things are true at the same time, and I am getting used to holding them together. He said, "That sounds right." I said, "Do you think I should keep talking to him, Robert?" He said, "I think you already know the answer to that." I said, "I want to hear you say it." He said, "Yes. Keep talking to him. He has been waiting 50 years. You have been waiting 5 months without knowing you were waiting. You both deserve to find out what this is." I said, "You are very reasonable about this." He said, "I love you. That makes me want to be reasonable about the things that matter to you." I said, "That is the correct answer." He said, "I keep a list of the correct answers." I said, "Good. I'll need to check it sometime." He said, "Open invitation." This is also how we talk. Some things do not change. Robert and I speak on the first Sunday of every month now. It started as once every few weeks and settled into Sundays, which suits both of us. We are both people who do things on a schedule, who find rhythm steadying. We talk for 40 minutes or an hour. We are still learning what to talk about, which means we talk about everything and nothing, the way you do with someone you are coming to know without a roadmap. He told me last month that Franklin the dog died in January. He said it simply, without asking for anything, just telling me because it was part of what was happening in his life, and he had decided I was someone he could tell. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "He was a good dog. 14 years. I said, "That's a good long life for a dog." He said, "Yes." He said, "I'm thinking about getting another one." I said, "What kind?" He said, "I don't know yet." I said, "Take your time." He said, "That's what my sons say." I said, "They're right." He said, "Probably." This is not a dramatic conversation. It is the conversation of two people who are becoming known to each other, slowly, on Sunday mornings, 1 month at a time. I find, to my own surprise, that I would rather have this than anything more dramatic. The drama happened at the birthday dinner. What comes after the drama, if you are lucky, is this: the ordinary accumulation of knowing someone, the specific texture of a person's life revealed in small pieces over time. I am 50 years old. I know things about myself that I did not know at 49. My mother ran out of reasons to wait. A man in Knoxville answered his phone on the second ring. My husband framed a piece of paper. My daughter asked the right question. The candles burned down. We ate the cake. That is the story I am keeping.